started. Just in respect, we're going to videotape this, and it's live streaming. And if people want to come back or come into the circle, that'd be great. And Sean will kind of pass the mic around. And we're going to start this conversation, critical animal studies, just to kind of give you a breadth of what it is, and then why are we talking about anarchism and ecology, and then how do we move from anarchism, and how do we define it, and if we can have a small discussion specifically about anarchism and defining anarchism, and then we can kind of go into ecology and non-human animal discussion and social justice, right? So we want to make sure that everybody in the room is on the same page with the knowledge that is needed to have a discussion on this for the next hour, right? Rather than believing that some people have everything. So we'll just kind of begin with like what you know about anarchism for the next 10 minutes. And then from there, be it if it's positive, negative, etc. So we'll just begin with some of those kind of discussions. If you want, if we can, Max, Jackie, if we can move this circle a lot bigger, and there's some coffee on the ground or smoothies or what, I don't know what all that is, but we're going to make that fairly little, and you can sit next to people as well, and we don't want anybody kind of in the back. What? Yeah. Awesome. All right, so we can just kind of pass this around on what we know about anarchism. If anybody wants to begin, and if I need to kind of assist the conversation, that'd be fine. Nathan and Jonathan and others can sit around the circle. And if you want to talk about the funny story that you have for the first time you heard the word anarchism, we can even begin there. So I'll just start it. Anarchism, for a lot of people, and if you want to raise your hands and kind of first, anarchism for a lot of people, the first time was something that was negative. And that's not for everybody in the room, but it was negative, it was violent, it was terrorism, it was chaos, it was disorder. So if that's the kind of framework that you have or had at the very beginning of understanding anarchism, kind of raise your hand. Okay, some people, okay. Awesome, all right. And if the first time you heard the term anarchism, it was mutual aid, consensus decision-making, helping each other, respect, inclusion, community circles, social change, activism. If it was that, raise your hand. Okay, we got about 4 or 5 people. And if we want to kind of move back that circle a little, just so we can get some more people in the circle. We've got some spaces over here, we've got a chair over here. That'd be great. We're going to aid into, there's a chair there, and if we want to kind of move that circle a little bit bigger, Jonathan, over there. There's, excellent. All right, so we have a good understanding. So what is anarchism? Who feels comfortable in saying like there we go.
I define it as a social structure with the primary focus of maintaining horizontality whenever possible.
Anybody like to add to that?
Yeah. So I think an important part of anarchism for me is like trying to see ways of and practice ways of relating to each other outside of or within oppressive power systems that challenge those systems. And like a lot of it is trying to dream and practice like things that others might say are impossible. So like, I think it's Marie Sholita talks about, whenever she talks about being a prison abolitionist, how people look at her like she rode in on a unicorn. And just like about bringing a critique of oppressive systems and the oppression of the state and hierarchical dominance-based relationships.
Anyone else want to add other things that they think of when they think of anarchism? It's an idea. What are some examples of what you would see as either successful or influential kind of anarchist movements or practices? What are some examples of anarchist practice or politics and practice, I guess?
Organization of the Zapatistas in the EZLN. Rojava.
The ELF, the Earth Liberation Front, Animal Liberation Front.
I think also like we underestimate ourselves in.
I think we underestimate ourselves in the way that we reflect anarchism in our everyday lives. Like, whenever you are in a group of people and you're deciding what you all want to go eat or what you all want to go see at the movies or whatever, collective kind of coming together and figuring out what it is that you actually want to go see with that person is, I mean, at its root, at its foundation is anarchism. So maybe even moving away from like those bigger movements and just recognizing that like in everyday life, we all practice anarchism if we're about mutual aid.
If we can kind of go into this idea of mutual aid and direct democracy, and then we're going to kind of sneak into ecology, animals, non-human animals, social change, and some of those kind of ideas. So let's kind of first get into like what is mutual aid, what is direct democracy, and I just want to let you know, anarchism is participation. So I don't know how many people are into anarchism in this room, but I would say a good amount. And then the rest of the people, I think, like talking and having somebody, not represent their voice. And I think everybody in this room is very, very intelligent and critical and open-minded and cares about social justice and caring about making the world better. And the only way of making the world better is actually talking. And talking not verbally, but talking with your body, as Madison was kind of speaking about on a panel. But we need to communicate. And so I don't want to be ableist and reinforcing verbal methods. But that being said, what is mutual aid and what's direct democracy? So let's see, I know there's a lot of grad students in this room and there's a lot of bachelor's degree people working on. And let's see if we can use this $100,000 education. Okay, I'm just going to walk to people and just pass it. Sound good? Yeah, all right.
I can.
There you go. Awesome.
So I think instead of kind of like you say, a hierarchical relationship of I have the power and the knowledge and you have a problem and I'm helping you, we're helping each other as peers, which is mutual aid.
Just adding on to that, I think it was Johnny in his presentation who talked about it, how mutual aid also kind of values dependence as the natural state of being and a state of being that we should cultivate as opposed to independence, and how independence plays off of not only ableist cliches but just certain ontologies, certain worldviews, and that mutual aid recognizes inherent dependence and the value of dependence. And hopefully, I would love to talk about it or hear views on how mutual aid extended to non-human animals, and not once we mutually assist human animals, okay, then we'll go and deal with them. And kind of jumping ahead, the same with colonization, decolonization. Animal bodies are colonized bodies, and how we can talk about decolonization with non-human animals as subjects of colonization.
So I'm just going to kind of give you another question. How is this an intersectional social justice conference? And it's not just about non-human animals, and that's not what you're into either. How is the body and property, like property was theft by pardon, which Madi kind of spoke about in her presentation. How is borders, bodies, and property problematic from an anarchist lens and aids into the liberation of people of color, people that are incarcerated, that are owned by the state, youth that are in foster care. So how is this property and bodies problematic?
I mean, the just fundamental notion of private property, period, as theft, I mean, as the statement goes, becomes problematic even when we're talking about items. Even, I mean, if we're gonna look through a lens that's everything is adamant, or like some panpsychic lens, then we're in like a different realm altogether. But just the notion that, obviously, the idea that, I'll just say, for more commonplace terms, like inanimate objects, if we're gonna call them these, like apples, rocks, and so on, they can even be owned as a problem in itself. And then stepping beyond that to actual bodies, actual persons, actual autonomy, actual nullification of any kind of self-will, which is assumed in non-human animal bodies. It's assumed that they are, as they say, the moment they assert autonomy, that has to be eradicated. I mean, there's contempt for the sovereignty of non-human animals, which also then gets extended when, I think I touched on it a little bit, the idea that species and race are completely intertwined. So the same thing carries over when we're talking about marginalized human bodies, who even their assertion of non-property status, their assertion of self-will, of autonomy, is a complete affront to, like, capital H humanity, white supremacist humanity, hierarchical humanity. And so I would say that that just all gets wrapped together about those things that are acceptable locations or acceptable entities of the assertion of autonomy, and those that aren't. And that builds up from, when we go from just the property of objects to what then we would consider subjects. I don't know if I answered the question, but I talked about it.
Sure. So I'm going to kind of, some of the ground rules that I work with in movements is like move forward, move back. So if indigenous voices in the room could speak about how property has oppressed and repressed them, be it at school or in their lives, and the concept of private property or property, period. And so we'll give that space to, let's open up to indigenous voices as well as women. So how has property been a problem to you and used against you? So we're list indigenous and women right now.
I don't necessarily see private property as a problem. It's the fact that when people over-accumulate, and like, I don't know, it's that whole he who dies the most wins, and that's the problem. We can't take just what we need, we take 10 times what we need. We take, so you don't have any on purpose. So it's not the private property itself, it's that we want to take so much that nobody else has any, and we're adamant about denying other people, which we shouldn't be. I guess if we took too much private property, we might want to share.
I just want to make sure what you mean by we, and I'm wanting to make sure what that identifying is, and I want to see if we can provide space for women right now, people that identify as women, and people that identify as indigenous or native. Does that make sense? Anybody wants to talk about property and how's that been problematic?
So I live on a reservation and I live in tribal housing, and I think how it becomes a problem is because these housing apartments or complexes are targeted, by authority, people in authority, because they know what type of people live there. and they're seen as criminals. You know, we have a lot of people on my block who are involved in criminal activity, but it's not all their fault. It's because of society. And I'm from the town of Ignacio, and it's 1 mile long, and we have state patrol, we have La Plata County, we have tribal police, we have town police, we have undercover cops, we have FBI people coming, all through just 1 mile. And I think that's a problem. It's a lot of people being targeted, and you don't see that kind of authority in upper class neighborhoods or on private property, because we can't obtain private property. It's harder for people of color, indigenous people specifically, like in this moment, for them to gain private property. And so the apartment that I live in, you see a lot of cops always coming in and out. I think that's a problem.
Thank you. And if Latino, Latinx, Chicano or Chicana people would like to speak about how property is problematic to them and how it's been used to oppress or repress them, that would be beautiful to hear voices from those voices in the circle.
My father has been property of the state. He's been in and out of different facilities for different reasons. But I think when I think about property and how each person could actually become property of the state, it's scary to me. Just hearing the stories, not only from him, but obviously his friends, the people that I grew up around. When you're incarcerated, it's a different world, and I don't know how many of you know people who have been incarcerated or what it feels like to not have anything except for 4 walls or be in a cage, literally. And so you don't have any freedom. You're told that you can go outside for 1 hour in the day, or just depending on where you are. But this understanding of property, like a human being property, and I mean we can relate that to many different things, but that concept is just very strange. I mean, somebody owns you, literally you are a number, and as long as my father goes without being incarcerated, he'll always remember what number he is. And that I think that's a way to break somebody down, and it makes you identify as just that number. That's who you are to the state, is just that number. And so, yeah, I just wanted to speak about incarceration.
I think it's good to open up for anyone else who has stories or ways that they see in which capitalism or property has come to burden or harm their lives.
So I'm a nurse, and I work in the healthcare industry, and one thing in this country that really, I think, destroys so many lives is just the healthcare system, and how people's lives are quite literally tied to their productivity in a job, and how unless they are, you can't even get health insurance in a lot of jobs unless you're working a certain number of hours per week. And so people are having to, work a lot in order to even just survive and even just pay for health insurance for their families, and it's just extremely difficult for people who can't work that much, people who are disabled, and even thinking about being able to work, people with families have to pay for childcare, and so it seems like just this whole system of working destroys us.
Yeah, is there anyone else who'd like to share any stories? I don't see it because there's actually 2 lights in right in my eyes here.
Yeah, just also, being a woman or someone who's femme, just like the ways that our bodies get treated as property. I mean, it's like I'm sure pretty obvious to everyone in this room. Yeah, and just like how we are like harassed, assaulted, the ways that our bodies are talked about on a regular basis, like even in anarchist spaces, like the ways that women's bodies are talked about, joked about, it's like pretty constant. So.
Anyone else? I might give one that I thought of. It's actually because Anthony was listening to Busy and there was an anti-Semitic component. But for the folks who do not know, the anti-Semitic tropes come from that same story. So in Europe, Jews were forced out of most forms of business and Christians were not allowed to sell or do usury. And so those in power and they hired the Jews to be the middle person. And then when people got angry at capitalist exploitation, they would round up and kill off the Jews as kind of an outlet for class hatred and anger. And so they were a group that was not actually gaining accumulation of wealth, but were actually the target of it. And you still see that same trope and narrative of kind of cabal in a lot of spaces where anti-Semitism comes up. Yeah. There's someone over there.
Does anyone else want to speak?
If not, we're going to go to the next step in this conversation when talking about respect, inclusion, mutual aid, direct democracy. And then, of course, we do have people, and anarchism is one of the big things is it critiques representation of people, and it critiques the representation of people as property and how these borders divide people, right? So that being said, let us get into a more conversation that has been kind of discussed indirectly throughout this weekend, is how does anarchism relate to the ecological world around us, as well as how does anarchism aid in the liberation of people, human people as well as non-human people, as well as the ecological world, right? The unions once said you can't have a job on a dead planet, right? And they were speaking with Judy Berry and Earth Firster when they said that, right? And so I think, let's try to make these connections. Let's see how far we can make these connections. So in your perspective, to make this simple, in your perspective, how does anarchism, or what you know about anarchism in the last 15 minutes, relate to protecting non-human animals or the ecological world, which I think everybody likes, but we don't know how to engage with, right? It's kind of a really unhealthy relationship we got, it's a very violent relationship. We love the person and we hurt them. And understanding that sometimes just because you like, for example, something to do with an individual doesn't mean that you get to do that thing with that individual anytime you want to do that with that individual, right? Being intimately or just hanging out and drinking coffee. Like, you don't get to determine when you hang out with that person, or you don't get to determine always when you go skiing or mountain biking. Sometimes those things hurt that person, right? And this is a living being that we're talking about. So we have to understand if we can respect this very simplistic metaphor of riding on bodies on our mountain bike, or skiing on bodies, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we have to change? Do we have to change? Et cetera, et cetera.
So just something I think is kind of humorous, or some of my favorite animal liberation activists are the ones that say things like, I don't really like animals that much, in the sense that they don't like spending time with animals, which is kind of a gross brush, but what I mean is that they still recognize that they have to fight for the liberation of non-human animals, and that that non-human animal's productivity value for them, even as a companion or as an acquaintance or something, is completely irrelevant to that struggle, that kind of basic consideration. So I don't say I join in that sentiment, but I appreciate that recognition because it doesn't link animal liberation, kind of horizontality, or basic moral consideration to any kind of result that person gets due to that relationship. And I also think on that note, and Hannah talked on it in her presentation about the speciesism that's embedded even in animal liberation spaces, it seems, where that kind of bringing everyone up to at least relatively similar, equal level of consideration involves not just recognizing non-human animals as just these beings that suffer like pain and pleasure, but they actually have rich lives, they have friends, they have communities, and that like the consideration that we owe them is typically much higher than we even estimate. And the kind of world that would bring about is a unicorn world, it seems. In the sense that it's unbelievable how much I think it's so hard to break out of our own speciesism. And I think through an anarchist lens, it would require that much uplifting to the point of a recognition of a kind of translation, a kind of interpretation of the rich lives that they had, and what that would mean if we actually started to look at them as individuals who had families, who had lives, who had culture, and not just like pleasure and pain, sites of pleasure and pain.
Would you mind just really quickly, I think that's really fascinating, and maybe think a little bit about how you see people doing that within anarchist movements, or if you've seen examples of it?
I can't say, I actually can't say from experience. Most of my time is in like anarchist movements that are doing that. I would just say that because in a lot of, most animal rights, most vegan spaces are not anarchist spaces. They're highly capitalist spaces. They are, and it's loving animal spaces. It's, I love animals, which is completely speciesist, as you can say over how many million animals. I love all animals. I mean, it's an absurd statement. Even saying I love dogs is an absurd statement. I love all dogs. It's an absurd statement. Maybe if you said like I love dog culture, you could say like I generally like the culture of dogness or chickenness, but that effaces their individuality. As anyone who has companion pets, our typical companion pets would never say, I mean, they will just attest to how much their one companion animal is so different than the other. So I joke sometimes, if you go to someone's house who has companion animals, and you really want to piss them off, like just keep calling the companion animal it all the time. Like, it's so pretty. Is it eating it? Is it coming with us? When's it doing this? And like they get pissed off, like real quick. Right? But then we'll talk about chickens, we'll talk about other non-human animals, and it's no problem. It's start to finish. So I would just say that that's the point. I think the animal rights spaces and vegan spaces need more of that anarchist intervention to say, no, this isn't about the potlucks and this and that. It's actually about not just recognizing that we need to give basic rights, which of course basic rights, but also even opening our eyes, our hearts, our minds to like the complete rich culture of not just individual species, but groups within species. Because we can't just say that there is dog culture, only generally.
I'll just say that, yeah, I see that a lot with, like, for example, I made a Facebook post a while ago about, like, I don't think vegans focus enough on fish, individuals in terms of activism, and, like, got a ton of likes, ton of hearts, and all that kind of stuff. And, it's obviously in terms of, fighting for different species here and there is obviously ones that experience like a varied amount of exploitation. I mean, we don't get milk from pigs, for example, but doesn't mean, you know, it kind of, I try to, I'm a social deconstructionist, so I don't subscribe to a lot of things. I don't use a lot of language. I kind of use my own language a lot of the times, and I think there is still a big emphasis on species and like the differences between us as species. You know, even saying non-human animals, thinking of it as, you know, everyone else is over there and then we're over here. Yes, sure, we're all talking to humans right now, but I think in an anarchist sense, just talking about individuals as, you know, and I use the word people, I've heard the word people being used for non-humans, and I think it's important to kind of, I know that a lot of it is to entice the general human public into like, oh, animals, we're, you know, kind of still using that language, but I find it problematic to continue using that. They need to know right away, I think, that when I say animals, I mean all of us. You need to know that, you know, and it's kind of like meeting them where they are when people say, well, you know, let's just use the language that exists for now. But I mean, I think it should all come together, and there's no problem. I mean, humans they'll be like, oh yeah, that's right, yeah, we are animals. Oh, like, you know, we all get taught that this language is normal, but it's logically, is it normal? It doesn't make sense. And in terms, yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of the spaces that, obviously, most of this animal liberationists, total liberation spaces I am in are with people that are here. So I think we can all agree that we want to make it more kind of not so, you know, specious, and kind of we try not to make it hierarchical and stuff like that. So good. Not sure I'm right about that. I mean, I'd like to. I'm still not. I know what anarchy is, and I've seen it, and but I'd like to ask what people think of like socialist anarchists, and like kind of. So the way I would call myself that, because if the government is not working, then yes, let's, you know, not deal with that. But I think there is a responsibility for, you know, we've set up these hierarchies. Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily like to continue hierarchies, but if they're there and they do what they're supposed to do, you know, help the communities and stuff like that, you know, I'd like to support that as well as anarchy. And I don't know if that is possible or whatever, but yeah.
Well, I feel like I struggle with those labels a lot too, and like thinking about, I don't know if this directly answers your question, is this possible? I don't know. But like I feel like in the Flagstaff Community Coalition, there's a lot of anarchists, and we're also working on legislation together, you know? So, yeah, I think it's interesting, and definitely like trying to use the structures that exist to interrupt, you know, federal immigration law, like, or fund a legal clinic in town. Like, we're pushing for all of those things, so. Yeah, that's not a direct answer to your question, but I don't know if others. I was gonna quickly say earlier, like, I think just like the interruption that anarchy provides to property relations, like, is super important in thinking about trying to build like more respectful and consensual relationships with all people, animals, non-human animals included, and so just trying to like inject like consent back into our relationships.
Yeah, I practice this in everyday life. Like when I'm at the dog park and someone says, "Oh, is that your dog?" I say, "That's my family member." If that was what you mean, like I don't pretend to conform because I don't think it's right. And this whole thing of ownership, especially over, like I mean, yeah, technically my human family members still own me, but like I don't feel owned. Why does my dog family member have to? I don't know. They don't care. But you know, I feel like humans think I own them. You know, the sense of like, oh, I don't have to feel that way anymore, and this whole thing of, you know, I like that apparently in Boulder it's actually required or whatever that they write guardian instead of owners, but then I hear in the shelters humans still saying owners and stuff like that, so it kind of, it doesn't, it contradicts itself. And I mean, I think it's absolutely ridiculous that humans think we own anything. I mean, it's all socially constructed, all this, it's arbitrary. Just because I'm sitting on this chair doesn't mean you can't pull it out from under me, you know, and you sit on it yourself. But some form of respect for, you know, things is great, but it is this kind of, especially here and especially in other capitalist places, it is this, like, mine, I have it. And progressively, actually being here, I've begun to share less, being in this country, and just because I see others, like, you know, being like, oh, do I want to share that, you know, kind of, and it's all about money in the end, and you know, it's, yeah, I go back and forth with it, even, you know, about stuff like food. I mean, it's, you don't own it, you own nothing, it's pieces of paper, it means nothing, but I guess it's, where do we put the value? I don't need to own things necessarily, but forming relationships with things is good, you know, like I have a relationship with inanimate things, but ownership, no, I wouldn't say I own anything, I mean, you know.
And just to expand on that, we can look from an economic perspective, which you were looking at, is that I own this from a value economic perspective, or from a religious perspective. Religion has been used to oppress people because you have stewardship or dominion over somebody. So you have an economic framework, a religious framework, or, you know, kind of a intellectual framework. So this individual is not intelligent enough, right? And so then we can test on this individual, we can enslave this individual, we can exploit this individual. So, you know, through religion or economics or intelligence, we've kind of exploited people into property, right? So if that kind of resonates with you, or we've talked about economics, we haven't spoke too much about how religion has been used to oppress people and different social groups. As well as we haven't talked about disability and how people's intelligence has been used. So we can kind of speak about that and relate that to the non-human world. And then we can also talk about some of the nuances within the animal liberation movement and how it's kind of moved forward. And I think that's really important, specifically about like open rescues versus underground animal liberation front, and how the history of that dialogue and discourse has worked. And then complicating that. So we can say, hey, you know, we had this conversation here at Fort Lewis College, and let's like push this movement forward, and let's like not start talking about the things that happened in the 90s and not addressing any of these things, if that makes sense. So what are some other issues that are going on in the movement right now that needs to be addressed in a healthy way and kind of moving us forward? That we don't talk about too much.
I guess I just have a question. So if we were to abolish the property status of animals outside of the context of any kind of legal law framework, I don't really know how that would work.
Can you explain a little bit more, just what?
So, like, think about, you know, the Non-Human Rights Project wants to create, I think they want to create a constitutional amendment that animals shall be persons rather than property. And so I guess a lot of, in terms of accountability and just how, you know, if we want to create a more just world for everyone, I guess I don't really know what accountability would look like without any laws.
That's a great question. Do you have? Yeah. And also just so people know, that's also a big component to environmental movement, of creating rights for trees or land spaces in the same kind of way.
I think just because we don't put someone, trees, anyone isn't or anything is not considered property doesn't mean we don't have responsibility. Like if they're people, like the humans are considered people, doesn't mean we don't have a responsibility or to take care of them if they are unable in certain ways. to support them. I think this notion that anything that's property, or you have responsibility over, and anyone that's not property kind of fend for themselves and stuff like that. And I don't think it's that way, being guardians versus being owners. That's really the issue, kind of. And so I would 100%, it's more for like, I know, non-humans, they might not know, but the way I speak about them, I mean, it's for respect. Like the Liberation Pledge, that I don't see that tables where items that are either, animal products are being eaten. I mean, really it's out of respect for the non-humans that had to go through that are there, that in general, at the end of the day, I don't care what the humans think. If they don't want to have a discussion with me about why I'm not sitting there, then I'm still not going to sit there. I'm going to, go away, because for me, at the end, it's about respect for others, and I think it would be, because I already see them as people. Obviously, the word people doesn't mean human, and so I think it would be a great step, because then it would show the general human population that other animals are people, because guess what? You're an animal, and also they should be treated as such. And obviously domesticated, dogs, cats, and others, they are there, they're domesticated because humans domesticated them. So there's no reason we shouldn't continue to take care of them and support them.
On Hannah's question, let's see, the law is never going to protect non-human animals. And the reason that projects like the Non-Human Animal Rights Project are valuable is because in the eyes of people who do think that the law gives legitimacy to actions, that would give legitimacy to them, that animals are people, which would hopefully create a culture sooner than we could otherwise, wherein animals are seen by people. But the value, it doesn't come from the government legitimizing that, because the government has no power to act except in negative ways. It comes from the people believing that that is a legitimate idea and fighting for that on their own, in their own communities.
And I think that's what's so important to remember. This is going to sound weird from somebody who just told you yesterday that I wanted to be a defense attorney in the future, but like the law does not dictate morality, right? So like, for example, I'm not harassing this person next to me because there's a law that says that I shouldn't do it. I'm just doing it because I respect this person and I'm not going to do it. You get what I'm saying? Like, I struggle with, like, a lot of people want to become attorneys because they're like, oh, I need to uphold the law. The law is something beautiful and to be respected. Like, I'm not down for that. I think that there's been a lot of laws that obviously have negatively impacted a lot of the people that I grew up around. I mean, people are able to be put in cages. Like, prisons are a thing. Like, when the Constitution was signed, black people were 3/5 of a vote. Like, genocide was legal. Like, all of these things were legal. You get what I'm saying? So, like, the law isn't what's going to protect us. It's not. And that's just my opinion. But I think it gets really dangerous when we start pushing for these laws. Like, when we're like, oh, we need to have more laws. We need to just, if only we can get this law passed. And under a certain lens, it's like, yes, there is a component of, like, there is some more protection for you, maybe, if you were to take it to trial, if you had the funds to do that. But realistically, most people don't go to trial, right? Like, that's not a realistic thing that happens in most cases. So I would just say, and I'm not disagreeing with anybody, but I would just say to examine yourself when you're pushing for laws. I think in the instance of, like, ICE and stuff like that, I mean, push for that, because if people don't have any rights at all, and people are just being killed and in holding cells and, forced to go back to a land that they don't even know. But I mean, it's, I guess I'm kind of being hypocritical in a way by saying push for some but not push for the others, but I think we should just evaluate ourselves and really think about what we're trying to do with these laws. Like, are the laws really going to protect us, or are we going to protect us? Like, we need to stop putting so much attention on the higher-ups, on these hierarchies, and saying, like, oh, well, if they could just enforce these laws. It's like, no, like, be down for your people. Like, when you see something going wrong, like, stick up for people, human or non-human, if we're still using that language, I don't know.
I was just going to add to, is it Marise, and then Marise and Logan was saying, And also a little bit about what Jay was talking about, in the sense that I think in the movement, I don't know, sometimes that refers to, but there's a lot of discussion about this kind of language that just never seems to go away. Like, you talk about pets, and I don't own my pet, even pet, of course. I don't own this animal, they're my companion, or I caretake. And I, for a long time, thought that was the right angle to take, but because we want to foreground the complete immorality of the law, the problematics of the law, that sometimes if I refer to companion animals as a situation of non-ownership, I am erasing the fact that under the law they are owned by me. That's just a fact that I can't change. Now my relationship to them outside of the law, I might not consider them property or have a kind of property relationship with them. But typically if I'm asked about companion animals, I say, yes, I do own them, and I fundamentally oppose the fact that I own them under the law. And that's what the liberation movement is trying to challenge. It's trying to challenge these relationships of ownership and property, and then sometimes even people who use and consume animals in other contexts talk about how their animals are family members, are family members, but under the law they're not family members. Under the law they can be dropped off at the shelter right now, no questions asked. They can be killed 2 weeks later, no questions asked. So I think there's this or even animal products. We don't like the language products, but animal bodies are products legally. They are productified. Their bodies are productified. And so there's this weird dance back and forth. And I think both tactics can be used intelligently, but sometimes I think it's about trying to shift things so much that we erase how much violence the law is doing. And what we need to fundamentally do is change laws around, say, property stance of human or non-humans. So I think we can use that language at first and then highlight the fact that that's what needs to be dismantled, or the law needs to be dismantled. But that's just a different approach that I've come to, but I see, it's debated forever, over that kind of language. And I guess I am curious in different ways other people maybe use that or think about it.
Yeah, just going off of what you said, I think often when we have these discussions, it's like, you're either for this or this, and you can't do both and I think that it's really important to recognize that so many of us are doing both and, or trying to, and still critical of the law, and also acknowledging the need for structural change and abolishing certain laws or the property status of animals as part of the work. And so just want to bring that in using all of these tactics, and also the prefigurative politics of trying to change our own relationships and acknowledge that, yeah, we are going to have to do the work of protecting each other, but also we can advocate for these changes at a structural level too.
Yeah, the only reason I said that it would be a good thing if we were to change, for example, the law of other animals being not considered property is because, frankly, a lot of humans do, whether respect is the right word, but they follow the law, and if they see a change like that, they're like, oh shit, this is serious. This is something I should think about. I think it should be both, obviously, because I think a lot of us here don't agree with a lot of laws, and granted they're stupid and arbitrary a lot of the time. I mean, they're all arbitrary, obviously, but yeah, I think if they saw changes in the laws, it would affect their behavior in terms of ones that are, the mainstream citizens or whatever, residents of a place. I think it would be a powerful thing. Should we focus all our attention on that? I don't know, because it's a more difficult change in terms of something, even we watched a documentary where we live in the Boulder area, where these people were fighting for, was it apes to, be considered people, and I mean, most of it is pushback, obviously. But I think it's valuable to recognize that good changes in the laws will affect a society one way or another. Maybe there'll be pushback, but then at least you can have the conversation.
Yeah, does anyone else have any more comments on this one, or other kind of major topics for the movement or tensions that we might need to talk about or engage with?
I would say part of the reason that the animal rights movement is so focused on legislative change right now is because anarchist strategy in the U.S. is severely lacking compared to Western European countries. The U.S. has really fell behind in terms of anarchist strategy and organization. And anarchist organizations have been getting a lot of press recently, but they haven't been very powerful at directing that press in positive ways for anarchy. And we mostly need like a massive organization strategy overhaul to make anarchy effective in the U.S. again, so that we don't need to rely on, or so that we don't believe that we need to rely on legal campaigns to make effective change.
Anyone else right now? If not, one topic that seems to have come up multiple times during presentations is on organizing and the tensions with animal liberation and indigenous groups. I was wondering if people had any thoughts or reflections on that topic.
It's just very broadly something I didn't really talk about at all, and something that probably is very obvious to people here is that part of the reason like anti-colonial framework is so important to me is that borders are a nightmare ecologically too. Like, I think there's a lot of good reasons to oppose them, but that's one that ties directly into ecology and like the rights of non-human animals. Maybe one of the examples I would give is like I talked about Yellowstone National Park. Bison have sort of like a minimum protection inside when they cross some line on a seasonal migration that's been going on for hundreds, thousands of years. They enter what is now considered the state of Montana, and it's sort of open season in terms of how they're treated, hunting, things like that. So yeah, I struggle a lot with all the kinds of things people are talking about, like different forms of like legal reform, or like where I live, we worked with city council to try to get some like minimum policies in place of non-cooperation with ICE. But yeah, I think long term, I don't see any way borders are compatible with total liberation. I think a lot of people would agree with that. But I guess just personally, that's part of why like my personal identity and like politics as a vegan sometimes do take a backseat when I'm working with indigenous communities on anti-colonial issues, especially stuff like energy extraction.
And I think we have to understand veganism and the animal liberation movement would only be feasible because of colonialism. It's a byproduct. So it was the moment that we separated ourselves from the wild, and then it was feasible to have the animal rights movement, the animal liberation movement, or the environmental movement, and it stems out of a resistance of colonialism, which people don't understand that it's a resistance of colonialism or a resistance of capitalism. So what happens is that people are still doing nonprofit industrial complex work, employees, leadership, and mimicking colonial behaviors while challenging people's morals and ethics, while not challenging the systems that perpetuated these morals and ethics in the first place. And so I think that's what's really like problem within the animal liberation environmental movements, which like they don't address colonialism and they don't address capitalism, and so they get all these celebrities involved. I don't know one movement that has more celebrities involved in it than the animal liberation movement. And those are the individuals on the big screen that are mimicking our movement. And so we have to like really take a look at like how are we organizing and why are we organizing? Are we holding these ducks that are dead in a beautiful like beach and taking pictures for CNN and C-SPAN, or should we kind of mimic what the Animal Liberation Front does and the E-Left does, is just like screw all the media and then let's do it. And I think that's we get caught up into the egoism, as well as we're the only movement that is run by the oppressor, right? And that's highly problematic, and we are caught up in this dilemma, right? And then we say we're the voice for the voiceless, and I think most people in this room understand how that's problematic. Turn off and close your eyes when you're watching like Meet Your Meat, and you'll hear the cows and the chickens and the pigs screaming for their life. They have voices, right? But you know, who is the celebrity of the month? Who's et cetera, that can support the animal liberation movement and fund it, right? So we can keep on doing what we want to do. And I think, I don't want to say burnout, but I do want to say like we have to take care of ourselves in this struggle and challenge each other within the struggle. And I think the moment that me being involved in this movement for about 25 years and talking to Max about it, and I told him, you know, on Friday evening, I was like, how I participated in this movement for such a long time and been challenged by a lot of people and a lot of organizations, which everybody, after a while, you were challenged by organizations and movements and people, is that like you say sorry. And I think it's really, really hard to say and take accountability and start working on yourself. If you want to be in this movement, that's the number one thing you got to do. It's not about burnout. It's not about how much resources and energy and how many hikes you need to do. It's about taking accountability and saying, sorry, I stepped on your toes, I did something, I offended you. And then allowing that other individual to give you space to learn and educate yourself on that. So we're not no compromise dogmatic asses. My bad. So I think that's what we really need to do. And if we had enough space, but what I want to give to you all, if you want to be in this movement, and I'm not trying to be elder or whatever, I screwed up a lot. And from race issues to disability to trans issues to et cetera, is just take ownership of it and then say what can I do to do it? And there's a lot of people that I say, even if you don't own it, put it on Facebook that you're reading something about feminism. They're like, no, I will not, right? And it's just why? Why don't you want to work on yourself? There's nothing to work on. I'm perfect. And there's a lot of people in these movements that really believe that, and that being Black liberation, trans, animal liberation, earth liberation, etc. And so me after this talk, me going up to somebody, Hannah or Jonathan or somebody, and saying, hey, I just want to tell you something. I'm not wanting you to blast it, but this is something that I did in this movement and I want to kind of work on. Just own your stuff with somebody in this movement, and then you'll last a lot longer. And then allow people to make mistakes. But we're not a punitive movement. We shouldn't be a punitive movement. Somebody screws up to a certain extent. If somebody's assaulted and aggressively violent, yeah, let's get them out, and then they can work on themselves, right? If they snitch, et cetera, et cetera. But I think for the most part, if it's not serious and it doesn't harm somebody directly, give them space to learn. Maybe this is too wishy-washy. Maybe I'm too much of a liberal now. But I do think we're all screwing up here. And I see in this movement and every movement, people last maybe 5 years, if not 6 months, and they're out. And it's sad, but I guarantee you, the people in the circle, I hope you all last 20, 30, 50 years, your whole life, but you're gonna bounce. And I hope you don't. Because this stuff that we're doing, from Food Not Bombs to animal liberation to disability, is very, very, very important. And we can't be here for a paycheck either. So, yeah, thanks so much. I'm sorry that it takes so much space. So if anybody else wants to say something. We do have to wrap up, and I was playing with my phone because I was trying to get Sean Swain, a political prisoner, and he was calling me, and I pushed the wrong button. I pushed 1, which means I don't want to talk to him, instead of 2. I was like, oh my gosh. So I emailed him, and I'm like, of course I can't call a prison and ask for somebody. So yeah, I do apologize. I was trying to get Sean to call him. Thank you so much, everybody, for all of your time, your energy, flying here. we're gonna wrap up now. This is the 16th annual, and I think it ends on a really good note, with all of you in a circle talking about a really important issue. Build friendship, build community, and take accountability for your stuff repetitively on a daily basis. It's kind of like an unhealthy domestic situation. You will not change in 5 minutes. When you call like, hey, I've changed. Can I have you back now? It's like, no, it takes a while. So like, don't break down somebody. Take a while. Work on yourself, and let everybody give you that space to work on yourself. So with that being said, yeah, if everybody, I put on this conference a few times with some academics, and I say this in a negative light. I never say academic in a good light. But I was like picking up a table, and they were like, cool, thank you so much for the conference. And I was like, yeah, you can get the other side. We're in this together. I didn't get paid for this. I threw a lot of my personal money into this. And I'm not saying like, oh, I'm much better than you, but like, we're in this together. And so if you could help me fold some tables and chairs and things, that would be beautiful. So until, as we always kind of end ICAST, until all are free. So take care of yourselves.